In today's episode, I will be having a conversation with Amber Yang. Amber is a media educator, holistic activist, dialogue facilitator, and a former public school educator. She currently works as the executive director for wanttoknow.info, a nonprofit information service founded by a high-level State Department whistleblower. Today's conversation will center on the big themes we've been discussing over the last few episodes, including things like the role of media during this time, the importance of being able to hold multiple perspectives during a time of deep chaos, and some key things that we might want to embrace to find more resilience in these current times. With that said, let's dive in. Well, Amber, it's great to finally have this conversation. I know we've been talking a lot offline and so much to talk about. But first things first. How you doing today?
I am feeling awake, alive, and just really curious about where we are as a society. And every morning I wake up and um, practice every day how to just be with the news and be with myself and work with my nervous system, as you know very well. But right now I'm feeling pretty grounded and centered and ready for this conversation.
Cool. Well, there's going to be lots of fun stuff to go with here in this conversation, and we're going to kind of stick to this theme of this series, which is really getting into the where are we right now, kind of what's going down, and how do we move forward? How do we kind of understand this idea of progress and what it would mean to start moving forward as a society that seems so divided? But to kick the conversation off, and I think I wanted to focus this way with your interview because um, you have such an interesting background and you've done a lot of things even at such a young age. And so I would say, what can you say in terms of what you've done both in the media space, but also in the space of, facilitating conversation around community, difficult conversations, these sorts of things. Give us a little background on both of those pieces there.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm moving through my last year in my 20s, and I've just been so blessed for these last 10 years to be engaging in the spaces that I have, like all the incredibly diverse spaces in my journey as an activist. I realized very quickly when I was like in fifth grade that my life purpose was rooted in social change and healing. I would see pictures of humanitarian aid workers and witnessing just the purest expressions of human goodness and possibility. And I wanted to dedicate my life to that. So here I am, uh, having had a lot of experience in the DEI social justice world to the MAGA world and to everything in between and beyond.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I spent many years deep in the public school systems, working with at-risk youth in the roughest parts of San Francisco, getting paid extra to ride the school bus home because they needed help de-escalating the violence and conflict. And then I moved to Marin County, where I ran a wellness center at a Bay Area high school. And I experienced intimately the darkest parts of the youth substance addiction and mental health crisis before, during, and after COVID. So there's a lot to even say with the changes of that. But I was also the restorative justice coordinator for the high school as well. So I worked directly with kids impacted by the juvenile hall system and mediated hundreds of conflicts between police officers, kids on opposite sides of gang factions, mentoring hundreds of some of the most vulnerable youth, and just facilitating community conversations to address really tough issues like substance use and transgender medicine for kids. And believe it or not, a few years ago, it was much easier to talk about this issue than now. And suicide. Our school experienced three suicides while I was working there. And I got to see just the whole range of how the school responded and the root causes driving all of it. And yeah, just the role of school police too, which was a big one, especially after George Floyd and his death. And I also just mediated a lot of conflicts at every level, like between administrators at the highest levels of power to the leaders of the school union, and just being a part of all of this human work. And the most important insight I got from this time is how little we actually talk to each other
Yeah.
and how transformative it is when we do. Like people who never thought they'd be in the same room together, actually listening to each other, opening their minds, and in many cases, laughing and shaking hands after.
Mm.
Like, talk about transformation.
Is
And
there
then
an
also,
example of one sort of conversation that would fall into that sort of category of how did they get in the same room together and how did it go?
oh my God, there's so many. Um, what would be the best one? Because I would facilitate a lot of conversations with students who like could not be in the same room without like biting each other's heads off.
Hmm.
And so within that was a whole world of transformation. But I would say something that stands out is after George Floyd, and there was a lot of outside activists that were calling for the defunding of the school police officers in our district. And then there was the police departments that were trying to hold on to their role in the system. And then there were all lots of kids and staff and family that had lots of stuff to say about it. I helped convene a month-long series that brought together all these different people with different views together to talk it out.
Hmm.
And we were including these social justice groups that, believed like F the police. We don't need a world with police. And to have them sit there and actually listen to all the things that police do that don't often get talked about, and to listen to the fact that like for me, actually, I'm going to just pause and say that for me, a big part of it was us recognizing that there were specific constructive actions we could take that move us towards what we want instead of our predefined conclusions like all we need is no police
Right.
or we just need more police. And we moved beyond that to really looking at de-escalation protocols and where would police best serve and where they wouldn't. And then we were actually collaborating across our differences, recognizing the limits of both perspectives and yet the strengths of both perspectives. And so by the end of that month, it was like really beautiful. There really wasn't a lot of reactivity in the room.
Hmm.
Um, I could say so much more, but
It didn't, and so what it sounds like is that conversation was trying to solve for a very difficult cultural climate at that time, where one side said we need no police, one side was saying no, we need more police and more of this kind of stuff, and or maybe there was a perspective of just like all police are racist or all police are this or whatever it might be. And it always seems as though those types of extreme positions are very much missing the mark, but maybe have some truth within them, right? And so it sounds like you were able to, in those conversations, there was a come to a solution and collaboration as people heard each other and truly heard each other. And it makes me think like there have been plenty of, let's say, sort of like town hall type meetings where people come together and talk about this stuff. And it never
mhm,
really goes anywhere because everybody's coming in with their heels dug in their position. So
yeah.
it seems like it's not just about coming in and having a conversation, but the spirit of that environment and the type of conversation that emerges. Can you touch on what was done to make it more about, hey, let's just give everybody the talking stick and give them a chance to talk? How did it differ in the way that you guys did it?
Yeah. Well, so it was on Zoom because it was post-COVID
Right.
times or the start of the pandemic. Um, and Well, I think a lot of it was redefining the purpose of why we're meeting. Like, the purpose of why we're meeting is not to come up with a decision about what to do with school police officers. The decision is to hear from the perspectives of other people who also want a safe community, who also want our kids to thrive. And how can we be in the same space? How can we even practice the slowing down to listening to each other
Hmm.
and recognizing that no one really wanted the escalating tensions? Like the school district for sure didn't want these activists all up in their district protesting. Um, and I think that the police officers, they really like I work being the restorative justice coordinator, I probably worked the most closely with them compared to a lot of other staff members at the school. And I saw very clearly the goodness and the service that they held in the work they do. I've also researched a lot about police corruption, and yet I just saw how we were so quick to dehumanize police
Mhm.
officers without realizing the larger system they operate in. So we come together with a clear purpose that unites all of us, that we want a safe community and we want kids to feel safe by the authority figures in their school. And we want to address actual harm and violence that does occur on campus. I mean, I was working with a lot of kids who were willing to kill other
Yeah.
kids. And so how do we address that? And I worked with a lot of Black communities in San Francisco who were like, I can't imagine living in a community without police officers. We need them.
Yeah.
And so there's clearly something bigger of, are we really going to be supporting our people of color, which was a big part of
Yeah.
this? Or are we just supporting our ideological views?
Right. Right.
But yeah, like a lot of it was setting up clear agreements. And, a big thing that I'd like to say is expect and accept lack of closure,
Mm.
which is not a common restorative justice talking peace agreement. But I think that's huge because we're all human
Yeah.
and we may not solve the problem in this call. We just start it. And so it relieves us of the pressure of having to even make this into a huge thing, which creates more stress and anxiety. Just anything we can do to relax the people and slow the conversation down and to create a space in which we can all just be safe together. That's really the focus that goes beyond just like the talking points on each
Yeah.
side.
Yeah. And did what you guys sort of achieve from that, is it still panning out as showing, having made a difference even up until now?
Well, the dialogue with the police
Yeah.
officers and all the whole community. Well, I think what it did is that it really got people to ask deeper questions, and so like well, the issue too is that there were lots of different political movements happening around like their DOJ contracts with the school police officers, which we were not aware of. And so it turns out that these meetings were meant to help shape the decisions of the school board for what the community felt about school police officers. And we collected lots of great data. And I guess the biggest thing is people realizing that we actually had much more agreement about community safety than we thought. And for me, that is a huge transformative point.
Yeah.
Even if that means that each side still holds down to their views, that we recognize that, wow, like I didn't know that a police officer also was really aware of police corruption
Yeah.
and how it disproportionately affects kids of color. But unfortunately, the school district had bigger plans in mind to bring more school police officers in, um, which wasn't great in terms of, having this dialogue and we're all here trying to slow things down. So that was like a big part of my realization too, is like, why is it that no matter what the majority of the needs and values of the community are, like, why is it that decisions made on the top hardly ever seem to be influenced by the actual needs and voices of the people?
Mhm.
And that's definitely something that I realized in my time at the school district, and then getting deeper into the world of global politics and news and media. Definitely had those same questions, which I can get into. But yeah, just to finish that with the school police
Yeah. Well,
officer conversation.
it's touching on a key big piece of the sort of puzzle there, especially as it relates to this overall theme that we're talking about of like, where are we in our world right now? When you look at the state of
Mhm.
geopolitics, when you look at the state of, or you could say the lack thereof, power that the average person feels that they have because of just the way we don't have our hands on the levers of control, and it seems as though more and more power is being centralized in terms of corruption, in terms of oligarchies, in terms of just political influence of any kind. Seems to just be growing, growing, growing at the higher levels, and people are having less and less power to some extent. But I'm curious, I guess, too, like before we kind of get deeper into some of these themes, maybe just lay out what you're doing on a media level now with Want to Know.
Yeah, well, I it might help to shape what led me to want to know,
Hmm.
because for me, something I realized in the schools is wow, how little we talk to each other and how game-changing it can be if we talked more to each other. But then also how rarely we question why things are the way they are, how we rarely connect the dots. And so part of my journey to leading wanttoknow.info, which is the nonprofit information service I lead now, that was founded by a high-level State Department whistleblower in 2003, where we are dedicated to uncovering the darker forces shaping society and driving history and global events today, as well as the powerful forces that are creating positive change and transformation on this earth. So we have this dual purpose. So what led me here was many things, but one of the turning points in my life with media activism is joining Project Censored, which is a media watchdog group working with universities across the country to uncover stories buried or ignored by corporate news. So I learned the difference between corporate news and independent news, corporate media ownership, which a lot of people, like journalism classes in schools, do not learn this, which is wild to me. So I learned to trace the financial and political interests that shape the news, what gets covered, what gets left out, and why. And in with Project Censored, I learned about stories of war crimes funded by our tax dollars, how government agencies turn a blind eye to the corporations that wield more influence than voters. This shapes everything. That goes way beyond partisan talking points. Like what gets put in to the food we eat? Well, cancer-causing chemicals banned all over the world, but allowed in the US. Or how our personal data gets exploited, or why two-thirds of bankruptcies in the US are linked to medical debt.
Hmm.
So great that we have all this representation and and just like elevating people of color and creating more visibility for marginalized groups, but this underlying economic issues that affect us all, we're just kind of making lives worse for all of us, no matter if we cared about the plight of people of color or trans people. And I just recognized this so clearly as a former Democrat. And back then I was like a proud Democrat. And then in Project Censored, really studying the narrative of Russian collusion with Trump in the 2016 election. And I really feel like it's important to just maybe zero in on this issue for a brief second, because this fueled so much outrage on the left, and it's still in our conversations today about Russiagate.
Yeah.
Programming us to believe that Trump was the worst, even though the DOJ concluded that there was no evidence to support this claim.
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, the entire narrative was actually served as a distraction from the real scandal, which was emails revealing that the DNC Hillary Clinton campaign and major news outlets colluded to block Bernie Sanders from securing the party's nomination.
Yeah.
So Sanders was rising in popularity, and then this press strategically smeared him as someone who doesn't care about racism and identity politics because he focused on economic inequality and the predatory institutions controlling our nation's wealth.
Yeah.
And then, like a lot of people don't know, that the DNC and Clinton campaign were fined for funding the Steele dossier that's now discredited,
Yeah.
and then to distract people from their own election interference.
Yeah.
Um,
It created their own
and then
propaganda.
exactly, and then and then just seeing how the Democratic Party actually fueled the very extremism they claimed to oppose when they financed, during the 2022 Republican primaries, they financed the most prominent figures in election denial to the tune of tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Democrats in 9 states worked to amplify the most extreme Republican candidates. And they did that because they're like, oh, this would help us defeat Trump in the general election.
Yeah.
But what it did was actually increase the reach of the most extreme voices and radicalize the right. So here I am learning about this in Project Censored. Like, what? Like, my party did this? I can't believe it. And so, what I think Project Censored did is that it didn't make me become a right winger. But what it did is that it really equipped me with the skills to read between the lines and begin making sense of the hidden interests manipulating mainstream media and influencing public opinion. Um, which actually leads me into like the other work I was doing in Project Censored, which was actually not that popular within Project Censored, which was writing about constructive journalism and solution-based news,
Yeah.
which I really saw was totally underreported. Like, how do we move towards what we're for, not just what we're against?
Yeah.
And to actually believe in goodness and possibility, and to break the cycle of disengagement and apathy and burnout that I was seeing in my friends, I was seeing in me, just this constant negative news overload, and then we're just not even thinking well. And what are the stories and examples and ideas that bring out the best in us? Like, okay, we're clear about what we don't like, but why do we let the conversation stop there? So here I was learning about electric co-ops building their own internet in the face of net neutrality rollbacks, top 20% internet speeds in the whole country. Um, Sweden's revolutionary garbage system that was converting the garbage into a national heating network. It was so efficient they literally had to take garbage from other countries. Or even powerful solutions to reverse environmental destruction like regenerative agriculture,
Yeah.
and then wondering like why Greta Thunberg and all these major climate change activists aren't looking at actual solutions. All they care about is like the CEO of oil
Yeah.
companies.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it kind of just had me thinking. I saw a quote that stunned me, and it's really influenced my path as a media activist. It's a quote by Kazuhaga, who is a nonviolent action leader. And he said that if we carry intergenerational trauma, we also carry intergenerational wisdom.
Mm.
So, like, I wanted to tap into this wisdom because I just was very like looking at all the corruption, looking at the darker forces in the halls of power that transcend the personalities installed in office, realizing that the two-party system is kind of this illusion that keeps us divided and distracted from the deeper power plays that control both parties. And I was like, I want to help people come together. I want to develop the right communication skills and organizing skills to bring people together. So, got my master's in organizational development, because I just wondered, how do we come to consensus together? It just seems so divided right now. How do we collaborate together? How do we work through conflict effectively? Because Gandhi says that conflict is as natural as breathing, and yet somehow we're just really struggling to move through it effectively.
Yeah.
And so I got this, pursued this graduate school program because I also really wanted to respond to the growing darkness that I saw within activism,
Oh, yeah.
um, which I'd love to share, but maybe I'll just pause and just
Yeah. I mean,
see if
that
you
that's
have
a
anything to.
that's a big can of worms to open, which I think it would be good to open. And we'll definitely come back to this. Um, I like as I'm hearing everything that you're saying, obviously there's so many aspects of overlap from my story and just seeing all the different things that I've seen and this need for wisdom, like the fact that what I think is happening in a big way is this goes back to the nervous system aspect of things, but we just seem so stuck and used to living in survival all of the time. And as we're living in survival all of the time, focusing on the negativity bias that our brain does have becomes
Mhm.
the default, right? And as opposed to our default is actually supposed to be open curiosity. And that's how you know we're kind of not living in a way where humans thrive because our default is that negativity bias versus our default being, hey, you know what, I should be open and curious because when you look at the human physiology and you understand that in order to thrive, you have to have great ventral vagal tone and you want to essentially be living in that space of your nervous system all the time. And then emergent from that space is this openness, this connectedness, this curiosity, this ability to move through conflict and not be triggered at the drop of a coin. Um, that's not what we're seeing in our world right now, right? We're seeing everybody responding with adversarial nature and kind of going at each other and losing resilience and burning out and all these different things. And it seems to be just such a obvious moment that, okay, we're losing our own ability to be in a good space to set the conditions within ourselves to be able to navigate this conflict that we're having. Um, and so, in a
Mm.
sense, I guess like I wanted to double click on that because I think that's so important. because you said something else that I think is really key that we could unpack here because it relates to the nature of our current moment. And you were essentially saying, um, like how do we navigate these conflicts and come to these agreements together, or even learn to synthesize information, not be so polarized, come to that point as a society where we're seeing more of the overlap versus all the ways in which we're different. And as you were saying that, I thought to myself, me and David and Madhava always talk, and we're laughing with each other because, the reality is our society is not a logical place. So just coming up with a methodology of getting people to see things logically is impossible, right? And so
Right.
the question here is like in your eyes, with the context of all of this, I'm curious, sort of two pieces here. Is one, like, from a big picture perspective, like, where do you see that we are at in our current political moment? And I say this because, I mean, the US is obviously a big focus because of the way Trump is handling geopolitical politics right now. So this moment of Trump and Elon Musk is a global conversation, right? So the question is like, where do you see, like, how would you describe what you're seeing in that dynamic? And then maybe mixed within there a little bit about how we are faced with this problem of how do we get each other to kind of be on somewhat of the same page as to what we're looking at, or at least how to look at it. And I know those are big
Mm.
questions, but this is the essence of what I want to get to in this series, is like, how do we
Yes.
orient towards our moment effectively?
Mm. I love that. Well, I love what you're saying that our natural state is open curiosity. And from that place, which I found in myself many times, not just, deep in meditation on a yoga mat, which has definitely happened, but also just like really recognizing and unpeeling the layers of me that get in the way of that open curiosity. And so, I mean, where we are now as a society, I mean, when you look at the economic conditions and the the state of our health, the state of our health, um, where over half of children have chronic illness and 77% of youth don't qualify for military service because of underlying health conditions. You really got to wonder, like, what are we doing to our youth? And
Mm,
definitely looking at adult stats. So our whole bodies, like our primary relationship is with ourselves. And literally, we are unhealthy and um, exposed to a lot of environmental stressors, and also most of us just working and grinding and being squeezed by the economy right now. And all of those conditions, I think, lead to just the basic struggle to tap into that open, curious curiosity you were talking about. But I think also there's something to say right now in this moment in time about what I would say is, like, the first word that comes up for me is the psychological power of groupthink, and even to the level of like looking at the psychology of cult culture, which I think is dominating a lot of conversations on both sides right now. And, like, I would gather with social justice activists when I was working in the high school, because I was a total social justice warrior. I mean, like, I was like advocating for all of our marginalized youth. And I would come together and I'd be like, hey, I really want to say something very edgy. Um, as a social justice lover, I do not feel that we are achieving our goals. I see people terrified to say the wrong thing. I see us canceling and attacking people. And I was like, by the way, that thing that happened in the classroom, I don't think that was racist. And the group of social justice activists were like, she said it. And I had this like realization of like, wow, we're like kind of all under a spell of groupthink.
yeah.
And it's not because we like don't think well, it's because there's so much pressure to for conformity of thought. Like I talked to so many progressives who were terrified to say the wrong thing. They're like, the last thing you'd want to be called is a racist or a transphobe or right winger, or like even if you're if you're looking at the Ukraine and questioning the official narrative, so, oh, you're a Putin talking piece, and you name it. And like I would also see this is the case for the alternative and anti-establishment communities, where all of a sudden it's like you're either for the elites or against the elites. There's nothing in between. If you listen to World Economic Forum, then you're brainwashed. Or you have to be pro-Palestine to the max or you're a Zionist. And I just kept seeing how this like these simplistic narratives and fear of being labeled as something that is deemed as bad to the people was like really stifling open dialogue. And so where we're at now, a Washington University revealed that political polarization has driven 40% of Americans to self-censor rather than risk speaking out.
Wow.
And there's a Cato Institute poll that said that 71% of Americans say that political correctness has silenced discussions we need to have, and that 58% have political views they're afraid to share.
Wow.
I remember an NPR article reported that most US scholars on the Middle East are self-censoring since October 7th. And like medical professionals are withholding their views on gender medicine for kids because we're all feeling the toxic culture of fear. And then so it creates this illusion of consensus.
Yeah.
And how I broke out of that, because at one point I was like, Trump's the worst guy. I'm a Democrat all the way, baby. And I was like writing about alternatives to policing. I was working within the newly established DEI department at Sonoma State during my time in graduate school. And I was teaching nonviolent activism studies and leadership at San Francisco State. And I was just so much of a believer of social justice. I still am. And I wanted to challenge my own perspectives and move beyond those echo chambers, because I really saw the limits of the social justice movement. And I saw that no matter how much we did to elevate people of color and queer people and trans people, that our problems as a whole still kept getting worse.
Yeah.
Why is that? So I spent time at Trump MAGA rallies where I met former Democrats and peace activists and countless working class people of all races who all wanted a better world. I went to vaccine safety conferences where I met some of the most intelligent and non-polarizing people I've ever met in science and medicine. And I made an informed choice not to get vaccinated, actually, and which was very hard working at the school. And I confused people because I couldn't be boxed as left or right according to all these stereotypes that are shoved down our throats all the time, which leads to this whole groupthink phenomenon. And I know I'm not the only one. Like I am seeing you, I'm looking at you, Joe, and I'm thinking about people in my life and people I look up to out in the digital world, that I'm part of a growing movement of courageous people all over the world who are beginning to see through the illusions that we're hopelessly divided and that the other side is the enemy, and realizing that if our worldview is so fragile that we couldn't possibly understand people across lines, and maybe that's where we need to start. And there's like a study by Moore in Common that revealed that Americans significantly overestimate the extremity of the beliefs held by those with differing viewpoints.
Yeah.
And so to me, I just think that's a powerful testament to where we are. One of my favorite quotes is by Peter Block. He's a civic engagement leader. And he says that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's certainty and being right. And so we've got all these answers about what's going on, which I think is actually one of the biggest problems we face today. And we extrapolate one person, one aspect of who a person is. Oh, well, you're someone on the right. That's all I need to know, that you're a Republican. Oh, you questioned the election in 2016. You must be an election denier. You're questioning gender medicine for youth. You must be anti-trans. And so we've got all these labels that result in us knowing less about each other and assuming we know more. And the end result is that we become so counter-aggressive and defensive and fearful, nervous system dysregulated to the max. And so something that I keep coming to from my time mediating all those conflicts in the school till now is that it's not our differences that divide us. It's the judgments about our differences.
Yeah.
And now I'm this director of wanttoknow.info, and we have an email list of like 13,000 people from literally all ends of the political and religious spectrum who want to know the darker forces shaping society and also the powerful forces creating positive change. And that we are here to inspire the transformation and healing of our world by offering the kind of information that empowers this shift. So I can say more about the consciousness piece, but I'll pause there
Yeah.
if you had any thoughts.
Lots of good stuff there, and like what I'm hearing from that and what I think about in what even just coming back, I'll tie in coming back to the Facebook. Like I kind of stepped away from social media for the most part over maybe the course of something like 2 to 3 years, barely using it, but still, writing during the COVID era and talking about things during the COVID era, and um, coming back every day to Facebook now that it's like a big part of our business again. Um, and seeing like what's really interesting from the context here is because CE was always that, ever since 2009, it was always exactly what you talked about, where people couldn't put us in a box. They were like, wait, are you guys on the left? Are you on the right? Like nobody could ever figure it out because, we weren't on either
Right.
perspective, or sorry, side of the political spectrum. And, and so we had generated 5 million followers where you have a chunk of people who are more on the left, a chunk of people who are more on the right, and then a chunk of people who are kind of, maybe you could say, independent or looking for new systems, or maybe they're more just open to like totally new ideas, right? And
Mm.
it's such a balance. It's such a balance on the page. So we post, every post we post that is about a political sort of thing, you see like 1/3 of the comments are like these predictable, you guys are crazy MAGAs, something or others, right? And then the other third are like, no, you guys are the ones that are crazy. And then there's the people who are like trying to quell both of those people. Like, guys, I've been following these guys for like 10 years. They're not on either side. They're giving you a bigger picture. Listen to it, right? And it's just so fascinating to see the almost robotic, predictable nature through which so many people are responding. And what I find fascinating about this, um, is, people are always blaming, right, the elitists for dividing everybody. But I
Mm.
mean, people are doing it themselves at this point, right? They're dividing each other. I mean, independent media is a source of division as much as mainstream media is, and we've been very vocal about this for a long time, but it has sort of risen up within this consciousness as we had really good conscious independent media for a long time. Censorship came, killed it all, and then replaced it with this usually heavily conservative driven media, or just media that may not be for a political party but that like wants war against all the bad guys and is creating all this, you're an idiot, all that kind of stuff. And I just find that that is now kind of like that moment that we're in, and you touched on it so beautifully with this different statistics. People are self-censoring. They don't want to say what they, we have this massive, people are overestimating how much we disagree or how much we actually disagree with each other in terms of issues. And so this, it kind of really touches upon things really, really nicely here. And I guess what would you say then about sort of that consciousness piece and maybe how it ties into the way that people are looking at this moment with Trump and Musk as either a golden era or like apocalypse? One of the other guests that I had a discussion with literally feels, and hey, great, totally okay to feel this, but believes we're in the apocalypse right now. And I'd love to know what you think about those ideas there.
Well, I come from the understanding when I've even just dabbled in history, and I'm definitely not a historian, but when you see just the evolution of humanity on a general scale, you realize that life, we've always held the creative tension of darkness and progress and change. And so when I look at the future, I don't think it's the apocalypse. I actually see a future in which justice and goodness and positive change coexists with emerging darknesses and emerging injustices and corruption. I see both um, and I've just seen so many times where we've been so afraid of what might happen and it didn't happen.
Hmm.
Um, or like even fears about like what might happen if we don't get vaccinated. And so many people got vaccinated and still got COVID really bad, and a lot of them have long COVID. And so these simplistic stories that we were told about if you don't get vaccinated, you're going to kill your grandmother, you're going to kill your grandfather. These were all fear. And so I question any narrative that brings me into exclusive fear. Um, I really have just read so many powerful stories. Like part of my work is like we scour the media landscape for our weekly newsletters to find cover-ups and corruption stories on high levels of power, but we're also part of our newsletter is inspirational stories every week. So I'm constantly challenging myself to find inspirational stories. And I have come to believe that there are so many different realities existing all at once.
Hmm.
And so this whole idea that like the whole world is going to reach an apocalypse moment or even our country, I think it's going to look different everywhere. I actually think things might get really weird this year. I think there's going to be lots of civil unrest.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a lot of economic issues, and the economy, I am guessing, is going to crash. And yet this is going to look different everywhere. So I'm more curious about how we might show up powerfully, um, like in a way where we are like to me where I think is most important is realizing that the more divided we are and the more we're fighting each other, the more chaotic it's going to be. And so I'm looking at my fears, and I think instead of this apocalypse moment with Trump and Musk, I'm just even more worried about the fact that we just can't even seem to listen to each other,
Yeah.
as basic as that. Um, and that we are literally in our own echo chambers and social bubbles in a time where I think we're really feeling the urge. I think life calls us into action when we feel this chaos, where I think we're in a transformation moment of moving from tribal consciousness to community
Hmm.
consciousness. And this tribal consciousness is forcing us to say that we have to only interact with people like us,
Yeah.
and that when conflicts emerge, when chaos emerges, we're the right people, we're the good people, they're the bad people. And so I think that that is the biggest threat to our future, are these tribalistic simplistic narratives that when you actually talk to people, like in a way, it's just so simple to me because I've talked to so many people across the divides, and it's just not what we think it is.
Yeah.
And the fears about Musk and Trump are a really good distraction. I mean, I thought last year, I was like, what are the points of intersectionality that could like bring us all together? Because here's the Me Too movement, but why isn't the Me Too movement covering how the FBI and the CIA worked to protect Jeffrey Epstein, who was trafficking young girls for elites and business like tycoons all over the world? Like, why isn't the Me Too movement? These are the places of intersectionality. Free speech and censorship too, with the book bans in the libraries and what's happening on social media with especially with COVID issues. And I was like really focused on what is the intersectionality. So I was like, aha, the waste and abuse of our taxpayer dollars will surely bring us all together. That's definitely going to bring us all together. Here we are. And that now we are so divided, and here we have the left that's like, oh, don't think that they're actually uncovering waste, alleged waste, fraud, and abuse. And then you have the right that's like kind of glorifying Trump and Musk. And my heart really does go out to all the people that lost their jobs or faced job insecurity. And I definitely wouldn't go about it the way that
Yeah.
Trump and Musk are doing. But I do see that what we're seeing now is an outdated and unaccountable machine, the organization of our government, that is reaching the end of its life cycle.
Yeah.
And it is chaotic right now. And so,
Well, to that, because I would agree. I mean, the critique that I've had is I think Musk and Trump are sort of identifying some of the very commonsensical issues that are there that are going to resonate with people. Everybody knows there's corruption. Everybody knows there's waste. everybody know there's massive lobbying and collusion and all these problems all over the place. But yes, they're kind of doing it bull in a china shop, just bulldoze everything and who cares what happens. But what rises out of this full-on destruction of government is, I think, what is going to be interesting, and really this is the conversation, is like, I agree that certain things should be torn down. I would do it more wisely. I would do it where you're not going to completely destroy people's lives in the process. But that is the extremity of Musk and Trump. I mean, and they're not, to me at least, they don't come across as the most empathetic or wise. Um, and at the end of the day, what is going to emerge out of this sort of teardown is the big question. And when I look at Musk and I look at Trump, and this is something that in the near term, right, we do have to deal with to some extent, is like, what are they going to create? We have this outdated system. I agree. You pointed out something really important, is the government is an outdated system that is really not run well, you know, and it needs to be changed. But there's some reasonable arguments out there that say, hey, there's a lot of techno bros who believe that the argument or the government should just be run by technologically minded people who essentially dictate based on technology and data what should happen within the government. And some people argue that that is what Musk is hoping to do, is essentially just use data and use a technological mindset to decide how everybody else should live. And so I'm curious, I guess, what do you see emerging from this administration as they tear things down?
Clearly on everyone's minds. It's like really hard to find something beyond what Trump and Musk are doing. Um, yeah, well, first of all, anyone who feels like they have a clear understanding of what Trump and Musk are doing, like we don't have a clear understanding. Like we
Yeah.
don't really know where Doge is gonna go. And um and it's funny because like on a basic level, like the first outrage about what's happening is, wow, he has access to the treasury system and access to all of our social security numbers, and he's going to make it hard for your grandma to have her social security benefits. And it's interesting because then it's like you look at it, it's like, well, he does need access to the treasury system to do what Doge intended, which is to understand the government spending and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah.
And then also, what I found interesting is that while I can really understand the outrage about an oligarch who definitely is self interested coming in with his big tech libertarian approach, um, it's like, what do we conveniently overlook in our outrage about
Yeah.
him? Like, first of all, our government has been exploited and manipulated by governments and big business for years. Like, that big national public data leak leaked pretty much every social security number in the US.
Yeah.
And why, but then there wasn't really outrage about that. There wasn't really outrage about other elites that actually control our system, but maybe not so obviously.
Hmm.
And like Bernie Sanders recently coming on to say, we can't let rich people run our country. It's like, where have you been? Like, where have you been in your election? Like, you know this, Bernie, you know this. So it's strange to see the left in their appropriate concern and outrage about a tech oligarch coming in. It's also like, what are you not seeing?
Hmm.
And like for me, something that I really feel is important to always ask is, who is benefiting from just the inflammatory, polarizing, exhausting media noise that we're all bombarded with? Who's incentivized to fuel the flames of our division so that we don't actually talk across our differences? And specifically with um, this whole situation with Musk and Trump, I am always asking, like, who benefits off of our government system set up so that trillions of our taxpayer dollars get squandered? Like literally trillions. These are numbers from the Government Accountability Office. It's not a conspiracy theory. And so literally trillions of our taxpayer dollars have been lost. Who benefits from that? Well, big business, politicians, defense contractors. They've all come to rely on the endless supply of unaccountable government spending. And somehow it's strange to me why that isn't really considered by the left. Because to me, a pillar of progressive politics is understanding the wealth inequality and understanding the flow of money and the corruption in the financial system. And that we are turning a blind eye to this big behemoth of darkness within our system in favor of only criticizing Musk and Trump and blaming everything on them.
Yeah.
Somehow that seems a little too simplified for me.
Yeah. I agree. I think, this goes back to so many different pieces to the puzzle that we've discussed already, where people are misinterpreting the nature of how other people are thinking. We have an inability to actually come together and talk. We're choosing these tribal positions and then allowing these tribal positions to kind of filter how we look at everything. And there's a sense in all of this survival that we need or want certainty in what Trump and Musk are doing. And so we're using these, it kind of brings up that really sort of common thing people will say, like, always understand and read up on history so that we don't end up repeating it. And then people will take that and apply it to now and say, guys, look at what Trump and Musk are doing. This is a repetition of the Nazis. And so therefore, because I have this wise quote, then I'm right, right? And this is kind of what's happening. And what I see in all of this is an inability to see what you're pointing out, which is, look, guys, there's things that are happening that are good here, and there's things that are happening that are not so bad. And we can't just gloss over all of it and pretend like our existing way of doing things is great. We have to be able to kind of, see all of it. The challenge is again, it goes back to this discussion of like, I think people are feeling, and this is maybe part of the problem, that they have so little power all the time. Like people don't ever feel, and they haven't felt, if people are being honest, I think viscerally, people probably haven't felt like their government represents them. I mean, maybe in a century, maybe longer, right? Like, how long really have people felt that their government represents them? I mean, maybe that never has happened. I don't know. But it feels louder than ever before that
Mm.
people feel like, well, if the government's not for me, if I'm being honest, and I don't really feel that, then now that I'm seeing uncertainty in the system, the only thing I'm comfortable with is this system that is broken as hell, but hey, it's the only thing I'm comfortable with. So now not only do I feel like I have no power and I'm not represented, but the only thing that I know is falling apart. Like, does that feel
Mm.
like a diagnosis of the moment a little bit?
Absolutely. Actually, I really like how you articulated that. Um, and in times of chaos, we tend to lean on what's familiar and what's comfortable, even if it's no longer serving us. Um, like somehow it's like the wisdom, as you have always talked about, is where is the wisdom? Like we've got all these incredible other skills, like we're incredibly smart, we're progressing technologically, yet is there wisdom in that?
Hmm.
We've had that conversation. And then I just wondering where the wisdom is in what's happening right now. And for me, what wisdom looks like is being able to hold the paradox of this moment, that I can see the wholeness and like I can look at anyone, even Trump and Musk, and I can see the good and I can see the absolute limits and challenges of these people. I can look at any issue and see a seed of truth and and being able to do that is pretty hard. Like it challenges you. We were born, our mind evolved to be dualistic, and we're kind of waking up as a society realizing that these dualisms no longer serve us. Yet we still have this brain that wants to um, either or things or us versus them things. There's something about pushing against something that allows us to feel like we have that control. And yet, when we get out of that way and we really see the wholeness of the situation, it becomes a lot more complicated and a lot more complex. And the worldview that I'm trying to be in is recognizing that every viewpoint I have helps me see the bigger picture, but it's not the full story. And so, especially when it comes to things I'm completely outraged about. And somehow, like, well, this Friday, tomorrow, there's going to be the economic blackout day. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like a big thing on social media, and it's mostly pushed by the left, where it's like, okay, for this whole day, like no supporting corporations. Like we're going to show them who's boss. And so it's like we've got these
Yeah.
symbolic acts of showing that we have power, and voting to me is a symbolic act. I mean, Batya Ungar Sargon is an independent journalist that traveled across the country interviewing working class people on both sides of the aisle. And she's like, what I found is that the right and the left in the working class had so much in common, and that the identity politics and all the hot topics leading up to the election didn't even have a place in their everyday
Yeah.
lives. And so, like, they know that their vote doesn't even represent them and their deeper values. They know that they're going to lose out either way.
Yeah.
And so, we have this interesting moment where we have these symbolic acts of, I'm powerful, my vote matters, my voice matters. And yet we come to this conclusion that maybe we don't have all that power, and maybe elections don't really matter as much as we think it does. And on some level, that is a really hard thing to come to. And I've talked to a lot of my friends on the left about it, and they don't agree. And they're like, well, check your privilege because we've got the privilege that we can vote in our country.
Yeah.
And it's like,
That's just yet another talking point, right? Check your privilege. It's a way
yeah.
of saying, don't look at the bigger feeling and issue that you have. And I think this is where what keeps coming to mind as you're talking, and the thing that I don't know, it just keeps popping in my head is the statement of really like the old ways of looking at the world just don't work anymore. And this
Mm,
was the essence of sort of the collective evolution about page, like many years ago when it was like, hey, what are we about? And it was,
mm,
guys, we have to reorient to how we're making sense of our world. We're in a moment of collapse, right? And this is in 2009 when I think the vast majority of people wouldn't even have felt this way, but here we are, and the tension every year is building in terms of what it feels like to hold on to the old ways of looking at it. It becomes harder and harder and harder and more empty and empty and empty to just make the statements of, oh no, but we should just be happy with our vote because that's a really hard thing, that we worked so hard to get. But it's like, yeah, but hold on a second. Let's look at the result that we're getting here. And let's look at the fact that it's not just me and you that are talking about what is the value of a vote, but there's millions of other people out there talking about what the value of the vote is. And I don't know that it's appropriate to just say we're all just stupid and we're all, just, extremists and this, that, whatever. It's like we all can articulate very clearly what our position is on this issue, especially with the evidence of what's happening in our world. And so I think part of what's coming out in me as we have this conversation is this feeling of, yeah, the old ways of looking at things, responding to things, trying to make sense of things don't work. And we're really being pushed to kind of ask bigger and better questions ultimately. But at the same time, there's this really challenging cultural moment where a chunk of us kind of understand that this isn't working to look at the world this way, and a whole bunch of others are saying, well, you're irrelevant then because you're talking like check your privilege, like that kind of that spirit of looking at it where it's just like, look, ultimately they're saying be quiet and just stay within the confines of the system, right? And yeah, I see that, and this is kind of the can of worms I wanted to open up because you mentioned it earlier as it relates to these pieces we're talking about here, which is like this essence of the old ways don't work. And you said earlier, there's almost like this shadow side to the activism. And there's this shadow side to the independent media world that is out there that we've seen where it's like, it is still very much the old ways. And
mm.
I'd be curious if you could kind of touch on what comes to mind there and maybe even what you wanted to open up in that can of worms from earlier that we said we'd come back to.
I love it. Well, I mean, something that immediately comes up in the moment is a quote by Carl Jung that said, thinking is hard. That's why most people judge.
Mm,
And so, something about how under stress, if we're not coming from our wiser conscious selves, which takes practice to get to know our wiser conscious selves, um, like we, under stress, we tend to um, we tend to judge and not stay open. And especially when we live in times where an opposing viewpoint is seen as like an existential threat, right? It's like, oh, the Republicans, they're denying the existence of trans people.
Hmm.
Like, wow, that is such a big comment. And if you believe that, if you're taught, if you're, it's like words, um, your words become the house you live in. And so if you're telling yourself that like my existence is dependent on someone else and that someone else isn't like aligning with how I see things, I mean, talk about existential. And it really silences the larger truth of what's happening. And and I really do think that if it wasn't for the media system set up to profit off of sensationalizing and hijacking our emotions all the time, because attention equals profit, like if that wasn't in play, and if we had just more of an understanding of how um, the power that the that these divisive narratives have been carefully constructed to keep us in these simplistic approaches to these complex multidimensional issues. Like if we were to be aware of that, I think that would change a lot. If we realize like, okay, we can talk about these issues openly and recognize that there are many people that are benefiting off of us being literally unable to talk about it.
Yeah.
So that's like the first one. Um, hmm. But so when I say thinking is hard, that's why most people judge, because there are seeds of truth in all the different claims that either side's like, that's preposterous. Like this whole idea, like the QAnoners of like, oh, the Democrats are an elite cabal that sacrifice children and abuse children. Um, and a lot of it is like the use of children for blackmail. I can totally understand why that sounds absolutely outrageous and it's like not the full picture. At the same time, there is a documented history of high level sex trafficking rings where children have been used for blackmail on both sides of the aisle. Um, and then we have a moment where Democrats believe that Nazis run our country. Um, and like I said, in the protests in Minneapolis, I saw tons of photos of protest signs of Musk on Adolf Hitler's body. And I was like, wow, because they're just oligarchs, and yes, a small part of their base is far right ideologues. That is true, but the vast majority of their base are everyday people who are just done with the
Yeah.
establishment. They're done with business as usual. They're done with this declining organization that our government is. um, and so what's interesting though is that with all this outrage about far right forces, why isn't the left talking about well, a lot of it is because a lot of people don't know that the whole start of the CIA was folding in like 1,000 Nazis into the science establishment. We learned a lot of their torture practices and mind control techniques through them, and we folded them in.
Mhm.
Like a lot of them still benefit from Social Security.
Operational
Um,
paperclip.
right, right. And then we've got just like a whole history of regime change operations all over the world, funded by our taxpayer dollars and black budget money, um, where we have propped up the most extreme far right forces in the world. And so when you see it that way, how does that change how we see what Musk is doing? And so there's seeds of truth in everything. And my experience talking with people who feel very identified with one side is that when you start deepening the conversation, which is what we need to do, she's like, oh, I'm just exhausted. It's just so exhausted. Can we just change the subject?
Yeah.
And so there's something about like, how do we hold the creative tension, which takes the nervous system regulation, which takes the ability to be able to regulate enough to like not just immediately go to exhaustion when things don't match up with their conveniently held narratives, but it's also embracing the idea that perception is an act of creation. We've got this brain that's designed to rewire itself. We've got this brain that's designed to grow and make new sense of things. And that it's not a scary thing to change our minds. It's not a scary thing to grow. And in fact, I love like the work of Ken Wilber's integrative psychology. It's like we transcend and include the best of all values, not just one value. And so I think we're all on this journey to wake up together in the face of all this chaos and great change. And like everyone's going to have their own approaches to all of this. And I like, I almost feel like we're in a collective bar fight. And the biggest focus right now is just getting people to stop banging each other in the heads or
With the
like
glass
smashing,
bottles.
I guess. Smashing each other in the head with like bottles. Like we're just trying to de-escalate right now because there's so much tension. It's like almost really hard to get people to think deeper when the energy and the social energy is so escalated.
Yeah.
Um, but I really do feel like there's truth to this massive shift we're in that we're talking about, which Jalaja Bonheim says she's an internationally recognized women's circle leader. She's brought together women from opposite sides of war who've experienced unspeakable tragedies to talk and have open dialogue. That she says in her books, The Sacred Ego, that we're moving from a tribal consciousness to a community consciousness, that the old tribal mind once helped us to survive by fostering loyalty and protection. Yet now, thousands of years later, we've outgrown this mind.
Yeah.
It's not serving us. And, um, even just a little dissent nowadays, or just even an acknowledgement of the humanity and validity of the other side, is like seen as like a betrayal to the
Yeah.
tribe. And so, like, we're just, and I see this on both sides, where it's like we justify authoritarian and oppressive tendencies in the name of protecting our ideology and
Yeah.
tribe. And Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of nonviolent communication, once said that the more people are trained to think in terms of moralistic judgments that imply wrongness and badness and a very black and white perspective, the more they're being trained to actually look outside themselves to outside authorities,
Yes.
right? And so that to me is a problem when we are acting as an echo and not a voice. And so I love to say, how do we be a voice, not an echo?
Mm.
And in the circles I led with children, with adults, definitely adults, it's like each of us here, like we may be part of a different department or a different side, yet ultimately we all have our own voices. Let's come from that place and come from a place where we are truly acting from our authentic voice, how we see it, and that we're actually listening to each other.
Mm.
And so I said cult earlier, though, because there's something to say about there are some cult elements on both sides with how we are reinforcing people to think like us, and then we punish them or we separate them or we dehumanize or we vilify them. And it reminds me of Loretta Ross, who is a professor, feminist, civil rights activist who spent her career actually building transformative relationships with KKK members and incarcerated men convicted of serious crimes against women. Here she is, like civil rights activist, feminist, black reproductive activist. Yet much of her activism became focused on healing cancel culture, this readiness to alienate and dehumanize a person on the basis of their beliefs. And she once said that a group of people thinking the same thing and moving in the same direction is a cult. But a group of people thinking different things and moving in the same direction is a real movement.
Yeah.
And so another woman I love, Grace Lee Boggs, labor activist, civil rights activist, she said people who are full of hate and anger can, against their oppressors, or who only see us versus them, can make a rebellion but not a revolution. And so if we are seeing things through us versus them, we're literally internalizing the values of our oppressor. That no matter, any group that achieves power, no matter how oppressed, is not going to act differently from their oppressors as long as they've not consciously adopted different values. And so this whole personal transformation and social transformation, the alignment of those, I mean, the fear, blame, and hatred of the other that tribalism consciousness creates is literally making us sick. I mean, I see posts from friends who are like, I can't sleep, like, I can't eat. I'm just so dysregulated. And these are like somatic embodiment practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like these negative feelings that come from tribalistic thinking literally affect our blood pressure, our immune system, our sense of well-being. It encourages us to feel like we live in this mean and dangerous world full of doom and gloom. But what would the community conscious look like, where we extend our circle of concern to those we fear, distrusted, or in most cases, just simply didn't know? And we create those spaces of safety and the medicine circle where each person has a gift or perspective that leads to the whole. And I've done this for years. I know you have. And I believe that we aren't just changing our relationships, we're healing this ancient pattern wired into us for generations. And we're taking responsibility to change and to question the validity and exclusiveness of our truths. Like I have this quote right here that I'm going to bring up. It's by Philip Shepard, who's an embodiment coach, and he said, "Ideas are seductive." Oh wait, I'm trying to. Okay, here it is. Ideas are seductive in their certainty and simplicity, but because any idea is a static construct, it stands independent of the present. To give your allegiance to an idea is to turn away from the connected intelligence of your being. I think the most dangerous people in the world are those who feel their ideas about the world more keenly than they feel the world itself, because they'll be disconnected from what is in front of them and can act out only out of their fantasy. Holding fast to an idea because it's frozen also promises to excuse you from having to change. But harmony requires us to change along with the whole. If you open yourself to the hum of the world, if you live in the present rather than in your idea of it, it will change you.
Mm.
So I love that
Yeah,
quote.
that's a good one. Um, there's so much to unpack there, and I really want to hit at some point on this authentic voice discussion a little bit, and how it can kind of kick into neutrality a bit. I know we talked about that.
Mm.
But within some of what you were saying too, there was this, I was hearing a lot of these feelings of just kind of tying it back to that idea of like the old ways, the, of which we oriented to our world and tried to make sense of it just don't work. Like here we are sitting here watching our system fall apart, watching all of this polarity, all of this division that's occurring, and almost trying to figure out, okay, so where are Trump and Musk going? Like, what are they going to do? And what is that? That's us as people, again, looking outside of ourselves, which is the old way that these guys are going to dictate where our world goes, right? And that is the old way, right? In many ways. And I get that there's a utility in having a governing sort of stewardship, right? Like sort of a centralization of sorts in how things are going to happen, because you need to be able to have a semblance of people kind of not dictating, but seeing the big picture and knowing how to wisely move forward, right? And if you're all in this sort of doing what is good for everybody, if you're coming from a place where, hey, I'm actually trying to do good for everybody, then you would trust very easily the nine elders or the nine people that would be in these positions of stewardship, and you would go on doing what you need to do, right? Um, and so I get that there's some utility in that type of governance or that type of stewardship. But what we have now is not even close to that, right? What we have now is this, here's these people at the top that are completely self-interested, maybe trying to do a couple of good things. And, we're looking to them. What are they going to do next? What are they going to do next? And yet, I think the invitation is to say, part of our conversation, and this kind of breaks down into the short term in system, short term out system, long term in system, long term out system
Mm.
sort of framework for kind of how I like to talk about solutions. Part of the moment is to say, hey, yeah, you know what? Like, it's not up to us to look to them all the time. Maybe let's start doing some grassroots movement stuff. Let's start figuring things out on our own and build enough strength down there that eventually certain levels of upper government become obsolete in their current form, right?
Mm.
Um, and that's maybe part of what's happening right now is an invitation to reorient in that way. And then, you were talking about this binary, my tribe, your tribe, um, that way of orienting to things and making sense of things also seems highly problematic. And again, the old way of looking at it. And, here we are needing to build this, culture of nuance, culture of complexity, being able to hold different possibilities. And again, when you look at it, I mean, that's what everybody, when everybody talks about interconnection, right? We're building this consciousness for interconnection. Like, it's not just a spiritual idea of feeling connected to and recognizing the impact that I make on all things and the quantum connection that exists. It also applies to how we think about things, right? And so, this concept of wisdom, how do we bring wisdom in is, yeah, slow down. We would need to be able to slow down and think more deeply about, we're about to make a decision about tech that could be exponentially destructive. Are we thinking 7 generations deep about this decision? Right? And of course, we can't get government to think that way because we have no power over that to some extent. But we can practice on our own. We can build a culture at the grassroots level that does that, right? And
Mm,
maybe there's short-term ways that we try and stop really catastrophic things, but we got to be able to build these skills within ourselves. There were several things you touched on. It takes skill to listen to your conscious wisdom, right? Which is something that you said. It does take skill. And just complaining about Elon and Trump, or Justin Trudeau here in Canada, is not going to build
mm,
that skill of inner wisdom and being able to listen to that. So this is something that we have to do and we can do. And this leads into something else you said, which was authentic voice. And
mm.
a lot of people, when they think about authentic voice, it's, I saw something, I'm mad. My authentic voice is just to yell at everybody about it, right? What does authentic voice mean to you, and kind of how do you see that sort of being enacted in our current moment?
Ooh. Well, I really value what you're saying. And it just has me thinking how slowing down is not necessarily like stopping
Mm,
progress. Like in a way, because there's so much uncertainty, and there has been before Trump and Musk got in and started doing their whole deconstructing of the government. Um, and in a way, they're kind of, like it's funny because like the left is acting like, oh, Trump's replacing everyone with party loyalists. But if you think about what the Biden administration did, they literally did that same thing. They just didn't have a Project 2025 manual that was publicized everywhere that said that. But it's like, it's interesting how, like, the more you learn from a critical thinking perspective, the more you realize that both parties have very similar
yeah.
agendas, very similar goals. It's just serving different
I'm
factions.
just going to plug in Project for a New American Century. That is a very
Mm.
important document. If people have not looked at that, it'll explain virtually everything that's happened over the last 25 years in America, foreign policy, everything. Israel, war in the Middle East, war on terror, all that stuff was all a plan from, long ago. But yeah,
Mhm.
continue on.
Right. And that Democratic presidential administration, like Obama was elected on a platform of peace. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, he actually started the biggest drone war ever that killed countless people all over the
Yep.
world. They even drone bombed funerals and weddings. And the Nobel what's his name? The the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, I think that's the name that like administers it, he was like, I really regret it now.
Oh, come
Because
on.
both both parties are the parties of war and money and so on. Both parties, their first loyalty is the money
Yeah.
party. And somehow that's been lost in the sauce with the partisan tribalism and just the partisan talking points. And so for me, when I think of an authentic voice, um, like I come like being in the social justice world, like we're taught that like anger is like our power, and it totally is. I mean, if you I loved this book called Motivated by Anger, Powered by Love. That's probably not it, but it's something like that, that looks at the lives of nonviolent activists who have now and who've been through trauma, who've experienced violence and trauma of some sort, and now they've become nonviolent activists. And they always said that anger was their motivator to change.
Yeah.
The issue, though, is that anger is not our stopping point. It's meant to transform us into what I would say is a vision of the world we actually want to live in,
Yeah.
and that we translate our sense of injustice into possibilities for a creative future. And so, when I think about my authentic voice, I well, I love to see it as owning my perspective. And when I mean that, it's literally not just like the first thought that comes up. It's like really taking time to slow down and say, what is the best of my thinking and insights? And taking the time to even establish my own stance. And I really don't think a lot of people do this. And with Want to Know, I'm kind of forced to do this all the time of like, what's really going on here? How do I figure this out? And actually, a Vedic astrologer looked at my chart and was like, wow, you've got all this Scorpio and Libra. You're like the detective. It's like, I totally feel like a detective. But not many people want to spend their time like the way I do, and also may not even have the resources and the time to do so. But it's like there's something to say about how our authentic voice comes, is with us every second, every moment, and yet we have to like refine it. We have to build it. And like the authenticity is not fixed. It's not like, okay, I've got this like insight, and now that's my authentic voice and I'm sticking with it. It's like I think our authenticity is dependent on our ability to change and flow, and what I would say include, transcend and include, realizing that our views right now have a piece of the truth and there's always more to expand. There's always things we haven't seen before. It's like actually the school police officer conversation, I had the metaphor of um, like you're walking through a forest and you can only see from your stance, and yet what would it be like if we were to zoom out?
Mm.
Or even we're walking on a trail and like we can only see right in front of us, and then maybe we turn and there's something totally different, so we don't know what's to come.
Yeah.
And that for me inspires me to ground my authenticity and my ability to flow and be changed and be open, and that my stance is a reflection of not of my openness but also my insights from that openness. So it's like when I discovered how corrupt the Democratic Party is as a former Democrat, and I had this like whole like unlearning moment of realizing that the Democratic Party is just as corrupt as the right, which I was born and raised in the Bay Area, California. Like it's not cool to be Republican there. And I've talked to a lot of Republican students who don't feel safe to share their views. And so like I was like taught all these things. And then when I realized that things weren't the full truth, my authentic voice folded in those insights. So I'm not just being like, okay, well, the right says this and the left says this, and then stopping there.
Yeah.
It's like both sides say this, and here's what I'm coming to, knowing that my views and all of our views are going to be imperfect, but I can really integrate and have the courage to trust my voice and to trust my way of seeing things and my own embodied intelligence that comes from something beyond what was given to me in the media.
Mhm.
Like I really feel like anytime I'm parroting one narrative and it sounds exactly like mainstream media, it's like, okay, time to check that
Yeah.
out. Time to, because I know the corrupt influences within the media. And until that changes, I'm going to be very suspicious of these simplified, packaged right partisan talking point, left partisan talking point. My authenticity is like, how do I find my way through that, open up to all sides, and then be willing to have my insights change and that I speak to that. Like maybe I don't know.
Right.
But when I first started learning about transgender medicine for kids as the queer advisor on campus, helping create the first Pride Festival in that area for youth, and being totally for the rights and the voices of trans youth, and then reading though the concerns and actually what top leaders in the world of transgender medicine have said behind closed doors. And I did a whole video about this, about the illusion of consensus on transgender medicine.
Yeah.
That was very courageous for me to speak out and to not necessarily say that like, the right has it all together, or that, transgender medicine is always bad. But it's like, once again, when the deeper nuances of any topic get totally thrown out of the conversation, and then it becomes a whole, you're either anti-trans or
Yeah.
pro-trans. And if you're pro-trans, then you don't question the narrative. You're anti-trans if you question the narrative. That's not authenticity to me.
Yeah.
Authenticity is being willing to look. And so, like, I also feel like there's this idea that we're not supposed to be biased. And these fact checking organizations come in and they're like, we're going to tell you the truth because this is
Yeah.
biased, right? Or ground news is like, oh, anyone who questions vaccines, right wing bias. Anyone who talks about January 6th, left wing bias. And then we have this whole assigning everyone in complex issues to partisan labels. Um, but something I've learned in Project Censored is that media literacy is recognizing and accepting that there will always be bias, no matter what the publication is, no matter how much that journalist won all these awards for like game changing, um, uncovering abuses of power, that we're always going to have bias. And real democracy is really having that open marketplace of biases and opinions with open dialogue, that you can't really eliminate bias. But the problem is that right now some biases are being upheld as the truth,
Yes.
and then other biases are being canceled or
Yeah.
censored. And then so you don't have an equity. And so um to me, like, and then so it's like when my authentic voice shows up and then I'm kind of honoring my opinions and honoring my biases, coming from a place that we can never be fully certain about what's going on. It's like I'm breaking through the spell of this idea that it has to be an either or thing, or that everything I say has to lead to some sort of outcome where one faction loses. Like,
Yeah.
these are all old stories.
Yeah.
Um,
I think just on that point, what's one thing just recently happened that was so interesting. On Facebook, I had written a post about something. I think it was related to RFK, and I was just sort of appealing to the. It was about vaccines, and I was sort of appealing to this idea of like, look, I think most people generally, and I see this all the time as somebody who's investigated vaccines in deep detail for 16 years. I have another friend that's worked for us for about 13 years who's also deeply in it. We've spoken to scientists and doctors and different experts all over the place with regards to this topic. And I can sit here in this chair and tell you that, yes, I know more about vaccines than the vast majority of doctors who got a snippet of training on vaccines
mm,
in their medical school. And that is just the truth. Like when you dedicate yourself that deeply to a particular topic, it is likely you're going to know more about it than the people who appear like they're going to know more. Like, do I know more than a really well researched, vaccinologist? No. But do I know more than the average doctor? Absolutely. Yet you get these average doctors giving these talking points on mainstream media and as if they're an expert on it. And they're going to say things that sound nothing like what the truth is on the issue because it's clear they don't understand the issue. And then you come in as this average person who's just put like thousands of hours of research into this topic and you're like you have no value, your opinion means nothing. And so I was making this post and I was kind of explaining this dynamic. And I offered somebody to read a book and whatever. And then had said beneath it, it's like the issue is like we're being misled around so many of these issues. And one of the comments came in and said, "Oh, like your page isn't biased at all, and like you aren't misleading
mm,
people with your bias." And I said, "Well, no, I think here's the difference. It's like I think we do have a little bit of bias in the sense that, yeah, I do agree with what Kennedy's doing on certain issues because, I mean, it's what we've advocated for since long before Kennedy even started talking about these things. So it's like, here's a guy that just
mm,
represents my views that's in a position of power." But I said, yeah, we're always going to have a little bit of bias. The key is not succumbing to that bias, right? And
yes.
it's so it's like when we have our course that me and Madhava put together, Overcoming Bias and Improving Critical Thinking, it's it's about being able to be aware of your bias and the sources of your bias, but not
Yeah.
necessarily ridding them 100% because that's impossible. But it's so that you don't get tripped up in them. It's so that it doesn't shut
Mm,
down your sense making. It's so that it doesn't become your viewpoint that makes you feel certain about something that you can't be certain about, right? It's so that, as you've been pointing out, you can keep an open mind, that you can
Mm,
flow, that you can change your mind in the face of evidence, right? That is the skill that, needs to be developed. And yeah, there will be some bias here and there, but it's not ruling you. Whereas with other
mm,
people, it's like, and for example, the way that we had written the post on Facebook, it was like, there's some bias in here, but it's like I'm biased about the fact that I think what Kennedy's doing is good. But the way that I'm
mm,
conveying the information is I'm showing you where there's uncertainty in these other positions that are claiming to be certain. There's nothing biased about
mm,
that, right? And so I
mm,
think there is this culture that needs to be built to some extent where, yeah, like we do know how to make sense of things. We know how to kind of get to that authentic voice, um, which I like the way you described all of that. I think, the way you kind of touched on this idea of just having that flow, being able to change your mind in the face of new evidence. When I wrote that in response to the comment that said our page was biased and whatever, shockingly, it had like 100 and something likes on it, which you don't really get on comments, but it showed that people are actually starting to get the importance of that, the importance of being able to
mm.
change your mind. And yeah, I thought that was an interesting thing to share in response to what you threw down there.
I love that. And the likes on your comment reminds me of just so many times I've been in meetings with mostly social justice left-minded people because they're all up in the public school systems, and we're talking about like the a new ethnic studies program that we were implementing in the high school that could be, substituted for level 2 US government studies or something like that. And like I would speak out and say like, "Hey, this is the perfect opportunity to like not just talk about how people of color have been oppressed and look how hard it's been, and but really like create a whole section about where are we now as activists and how might we fold in the wisdom of like Martin Luther King Jr. with his nonviolent activism, because he was critical of the racial justice movement, that it was all about stomping over white people
Yeah.
and it was not about the liberation of all people.
Yes.
And plus, he was really starting to understand that the real purveyors of harm were the warmongers and the people that were creating poverty in the country that affects all of us, not just black people. Um, and I was like, we really need to be bringing in positive narratives that remind us of the best of the civil rights movement. Like, there's nothing about the civil rights movement. It's just all these like horrible stories about how people of color have been oppressed. And it's like so much victim
Yeah.
mindset. And like, it's courageous for me to just say that and not dance around it. But it's like, honestly, that's what I witnessed is like, we're really training. Like, there was an educator in San Francisco that wrote a column for Newsweek that said, we're literally training kids to be snowflakes. Like,
Yeah.
especially if you're like somehow marginalized in any way, shape, or form. And I said this and I got met with absolute silence. And I was like, ooh, okay, well, that kind of
Tough
sucks.
room.
But yeah, and then all of a sudden, later that day, I got tons of emails. I love what you
Yeah.
said. Like, oh, so good. And I was like, why didn't you speak out,
Right.
right?
Everybody's
So
afraid.
that's, I think, the authenticity is the ability, the willingness and the courage to speak out, not to say that I've got the answers, so you need to hear me, because that's often what activism is like, I've got the answers, listen to me, I'm right. But it's more like, oh, here's what I'm noticing and here's what I heard. How does that change what we're doing? And it's kind of scary to do that, especially when you're surrounded by people who are all incentivized to think the same thing because they want to fit in the tribe. They don't want to say the wrong thing. And like, I kind of, like, in a way, I was like, okay, I'm a woman of color and I'm young. Like, I'm the, like, on a generational differences, like, I was one of the youngest educators. So it's like, I felt like, okay, in the frame of oppression points, like I've got it going on, so let me speak. And I really wanted to like be courageous to just break through this whole like everything is about identity politics, because all the primary issues facing our country right now is not exclusive to race, gender, or partisan
Yeah.
differences. And that's like really why I feel like identity politics is stifling our authentic voice and and creating a culture of silence and
Hmm.
fear that we talked about earlier in this call, but also like reminding me of how like people are just like supporting you quietly because they themselves still need to find their authentic voice and to like break through the spell of groupthink.
Hmm.
And we know we're so vulnerable to groupthink. It doesn't matter how wise and sophisticated we are, like the Ash conformity experiments that showed how people were willing to say one line was longer, even
Yeah.
though it clearly wasn't, but they had someone suggest it to them. And so the one of the key takeaways is that even just dialogue with one other person that thinks differently than you can break through the spell of conformity and groupthink. And I think that that is where we can find our authentic
Yeah.
voice. And we are willing to speak to what we're seeing, and we co-create and simultaneously co-creating spaces where dissent can be welcomed and not just seen as like a kind of nice symbolic tool, because like it's so funny to walk into these social justice spaces of like diversity, equity, inclusion. I don't see much of that towards the right. I don't see much of that towards those who question the vaccines. And then one more thing about media literacy here is like, I'd want to know, we've been around since like 2001 and we became a nonprofit in 2006, but we have in our archive and database clips that are now taken down on 60 Minutes of 60 like a 60 minutes program that interviews kids who were like permanently paralyzed after a wide variety of the childhood
Yeah.
vaccines. We've got an MSNBC article interviewing Kennedy about what's in those vaccines and how it could possibly cause harm. And it wasn't like some sort of polarized issue. And it didn't even lead to us saying, oh, we need to take out vaccines. It was just like, we were just talking about
Yeah.
it. And we actually have articles from 2008, like CBS News, interviewing doctors who are concerned about the aluminum and mercury
Yeah.
connection in the vaccines. And so when you think about it, it's kind of like it's a problem of there's things not being covered.
Right.
And so maybe we can all just assume that the corporate media systems now, as we see it, they may not be showing us the full story. So we're literally only seeing like this.
Yes, oh, for sure. And this idea that, vaccine and autism link has been widely debunked and all these, and it's like if anybody has ever looked at the science and the studies that have been done, it's like this is not even close. Like it's the conversation is still so unclear as to what's going on. Um, I remember the famous study, the DiStefano study, it's like it concluded that the viral particle in the MMR vaccine wasn't linked to autism. Okay, so what about the
Mm.
vaccine itself, right? And then what about the totality of vaccines, right? Like I think the argument from um, the vaccine space that people questioning it, the cautionary space, I don't think people understand really what it is, and I think that's another big part of it. And so it's kind of like a straw man takedown of so many pieces to this, but um, I feel like there's like a lot of things and places we can still go and discuss, and I'm sure we'll just have to have more conversations. But what I want to do is kind of just hear, maybe some closing thoughts, maybe some, people, we've talked about so many different pieces, and you shared so many interesting stories and pieces of wisdom from your story. But like, if you had to say, like, people that are listening, they want to feel like they're making an impact, or they want to feel like they're taking some action towards a time that feels very uncertain, unstable, polarizing, that we don't really have a lot of power over what exactly people at the top are going to do. What can people do in your eyes, to kind of get in that position of feeling like they're maybe on the right path, contributing to something bigger?
Mm. Wow. Well, yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question because I think it's going to look so different for everyone, as we all know. Um, but I think, like, in a way, it's like something I come to when I get really activated and judgmental, because we all do. Definitely, like, looking at the media landscape and totally feeling judgmental about certain groups, certain people. And I feel that everywhere. Um, and like honoring my humanity, that it's really hard to hold these topics, and that like many of us really are um, exhausted about like reading the news, and that we're really, and a lot of us, like I'm living paycheck to paycheck, many people are, and it's like we're all being squeezed right now. And so like first and foremost, it's like how do we honor our humanity and honor just the hardness of what we're feeling right now, and really feel it. And see, that's why I think is so important with the nervous system regulation is like how do we feel this discomfort and exhaustion, because that's like a word that comes up a lot. And sometimes we use exhaustion to excuse us from thinking deeper or um, making changes in our life. Because I think in a way we're like avoiding the exhaustion. We're not going through it and moving through it. And so when I get really activated and find myself not coping well, it's like I really want to feel it and feel my humanity and let myself cry or let myself get angry for a little bit, knowing that these are temporary states. Um, but ultimately, it's like I need to release the energy, because if I'm holding on to the energy, I can't make way for all the new things that could lead to everything we're talking about right now. And so, like, somehow, this whole like checking in, like, because I think that our consciousness isn't just some sort of like big picture even esoteric, like a lot of consciousness is talked about in an academic way or esoteric way,
Mhm.
but a lot of it is like our thoughts, our emotions, our actions. Like, am I taking the time to regulate my nervous system? Am I taking the time to feel my feelings?
Mhm.
Um, which sometimes means going beneath that anger or that outrage or judgment, which I think that's really what it means to feel our feelings. Is like, what's really driving that? Um, and then I think it's like also getting clear about what my unconditional goals and intentions are. And in a way, it's like we're getting so lost in blaming the other side or seeing the problems. And then we, in our outrage about that, can sometimes act from that very place that we're trying to change. Like, I love what Bell Hooks says, that without an ethic of love shaping our visions and aspirations, we continue to be seduced into continued allegiance to systems of domination.
Mhm.
And so, like, something about how, like, what do we really want? If we really want a world where, like, certain people are included in the collective conversation, how can I create more of that? Because making the right wrong or making any other wrong, it's literally creating more defensiveness and more fighting and more opposition. So am I really creating the world that I want?
Yeah.
And that means we have to get clear about our unconditional goals in the face of all of this VUCA world we live in, right? Which is like a military world. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Here we are.
Yeah.
And so what we can do is get clear about our unconditional goals and align our emotions, thoughts, and actions with that world. Um, and I think like really honoring that we got to start talking to each other. And any barrier we feel about talking to other people who have different views, we got to heal it. We got to fix that. Like that's something that we got to do. Um, so I would say that's what first comes up for me.
That is perfect, and I think you took a moment to really let that come, and what ended up coming out was, I think, honestly, probably some of the more powerful diagnoses that are that sort of is what's going on in our current moment, and what to do about it, that aren't really what people tend to come to as like, okay, yeah, this is what we should focus on. Oftentimes it is something so material from the standpoint of something policy based or systemic, which are
Right.
important, but our ability to regulate ourselves, get back to that point where, as I like to say, where we're able to perform embodied sense making, so to speak, and then
Mhm.
be able to converse and come together. Like, how do you solve a problem if you can't identify the problem clearly and define it, and then converse with the rest of the people involved as to what we're going to do to implement something or even to know what everybody feels about it, right? We have to be able to discuss. So these are huge, huge pieces. And thank you for sharing them. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. It sounds like you got one more thing.
Really quick. Yes, because I think that this is the perfect time to step into our creative energy.
Yeah.
So it's like, yep, systems are declining, systems are breaking down. We all recognize that no matter what. Like I saw AOC say on some sort of interview she was a part of recently. She's like, the system's breaking down. Maybe that's a good thing.
Mhm.
So it's like, we all know a system's breaking down. And every time I'm in a great transition in my life where nothing really makes sense anymore, things are changing, all my kind of like illusions of safety and security are like breaking out, breaking away. um, this is the perfect time to create new energy into our lives. Like, even just like, I really find a lot of wisdom in like brushing my teeth with an opposite
Yeah.
hand, doing new things in my life that kind of remind me of the changes happening on a simple level makes a huge difference with our consciousness. And also, new ways of seeing. I want to seek out new perspectives, not saying that it's going to change my perspectives. That's not the intention, but it's to open up to new creative energy and getting clear that that new creative energy is in service to greater good and possibility, not like proving someone wrong or anything like that, but it's in service to those unconditional goals.
Yeah. Well said. And it's funny because I just posted earlier today about brushing your teeth with the opposite hand. So yeah,
Synchronicities.
so we
I
should
love
cross.
it.
Um, but yeah, thanks so much for coming on, for sharing, and having this great conversation. And appreciate all of your time and wisdom and insight. And we'll definitely have to do it again.
Thank you so much, Joe, for creating a platform for me and many other voices and visionaries to share their diverse truths about what's going on. Here's to viewpoint diversity.
That's it. That's all. Thank you.